A taxi driver whistles a forgotten tune and uncovers a lonely millionaire's biggest secret. His son disappeared 15 years ago. But by following the trail, he discovers a truth that will change everything. Night was falling over the city when Enrique Valladares emerged from the luxurious building where he had held one of his endless meetings. The air was cool, and the sound of cars mixed with the fast pace of nightlife. Enrique, in an impeccable suit and with a tired look, raised his hand to hail a taxi. A yellow vehicle with worn paint stopped in front of him, and the driver, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a faded cap, looked at him through the rear-view mirror. "Where can I take you, sir?" the taxi driver asked in a friendly voice. "Rua das Palmeiras, number 45. Enrique answered automatically, adjusting himself in the worn leather seat. The car started, and Enrique, accustomed to silence, was lost in his own thoughts. He watched through the window as the city lights danced between buildings. But a soft sound began to invade the cabin. It was a whistle, a simple and sweet melody that floated in the air like a ghost from the past. Enrique felt his chest tighten suddenly. He blinked several times and looked at the taxi driver, who seemed absorbed in his driving, whistling casually, as if the melody meant nothing. But for Enrique, each note was a pang. That song, he knew it. For years, that melody had been his most intimate secret, a little lullaby he used to sing every night for his son, Pedro, before everything fell apart. "Excuse me," said Enrique, breaking the silence with a tense voice. "That song you're whistling, where do you know it from?" The taxi driver, surprised by the question, stopped whistling and smiled slightly. "Ah, this tune? I don't know, sir. I've whistled it for years, but I don't remember where I first heard it. Maybe someone close." "Why? Does it sound familiar?" Enrique did not answer immediately. His hands closed on his knees and he felt an involuntary tremble. How was this possible? That song had disappeared along with Pedro 15 years ago. No one else outside of his family should know it. "It's nothing," he finally murmured, trying to control his expression. The rest of the journey was silent, though Enrique could barely concentrate on anything else. His mind spun in circles, faster and faster. Memories of Pedro flooded into his consciousness. The nights beside his bed, the soft murmurs as he lulled him to sleep, his clear laughter echoing through the halls of his old house. When the taxi stopped at his destination, Enrique handed over a bill without even looking at the amount. Before getting out, he took one last look at the taxi driver, who seemed oblivious to his passenger's inner turmoil. Translated from Spanish to English, www.onlinedoctortranslator.com. "What is your name?" Enrique asked in a serious voice. "Joaquim, sir." "Joaquim Sousa," the taxi driver replied with a cordial smile. Enrique nodded slowly and got out of the car, his legs feeling heavier than usual. He stood on the sidewalk watching the taxi disappear into the traffic. Joaquim Sousa. The name stuck in his mind. Enrique didn't believe in coincidences, much less coincidences of this kind. As he climbed the stairs of his imposing mansion, a single thought echoed in his head. I had to find out more about Joaquim and about that melody that had transported him to a time he thought was buried. He entered his house, a vast and silent space that reflected his solitary life. He closed the door firmly, as if he wanted to shut out that disturbing encounter, but he couldn't. The song continued to resonate in his mind, like an echo that never fades away. He sank into a black leather chair, staring into space. For years, Enrique Valladares had built walls around himself to bury the pain of that loss. But a taxi driver's whistle had just opened a crack in that fortress, and now, the past was knocking at his door again. "Pedro," he whispered to himself, barely audibly. For the first time in a long time, a spark of hope lit up in his eyes. Enrique woke up before dawn. He had barely slept, tormented by that melody that kept repeating itself in his mind like an incessant echo. He got up from the armchair where he had spent the night and walked to the large window in his living room, from where he could see the city still shrouded in shadows. Outside, life went on. Inside, Enrique felt as if time had gone back 15 years. He looked at his reflection in the glass. The elegant man with the hardened gaze of years did not look anything like he had been in the past. He closed his eyes and let the memories wash over him, memories that he had always tried to bury under mountains of work and silence. Pedro was barely 6 years old when he disappeared. Enrique saw himself back then, a young, ambitious, and busy father, but one who found time every night to sit at the edge of his son's bed. Pedro would look at him with those huge, curious eyes and ask him to sing to him. Enrique, although not a man of much musical ability, would whistle that sweet melody invented on some random night, a simple tune that, unintentionally, became a secret bond between them. "Will you sing it to me again, Dad?" "Yes, of course, son," Enrique murmured out loud, as if he were answering a ghost. The sound of a clock brought him out of his thoughts, returning him to the cold reality of his loneliness. Since that fateful afternoon, everything had changed. Pedro disappeared into a park during a walk with his mother. It was seconds, just a blink of an eye, but enough to tear him from their lives. The frantic searches, the interrogations, the months of false hopes and the years of emptiness turned him into another person, a man consumed by guilt and frustration. Enrique had gone from being a loving father to a work-obsessed businessman. He clung to his success like a castaway to a life raft, believing that numbers in business would fill the hole Pedro had left. But the silence in his house was inescapable. The absence of laughter and small steps echoed in every corner. He walked over to an old bookshelf and picked up a small, dusty photo album. He opened it with shaking hands. There stood Pedro, his dark hair disheveled and a mischievous grin. Enrique slowly turned the pages, each image a pang in his chest. The last photo was the most painful. Taken days before the disappearance, Pedro was sitting on his lap, laughing as Enrique tried to teach him how to whistle. "I should never have..." Her voice broke, but she didn't finish the sentence. He took a deep breath and left the album on the table. Hope was something Enrique no longer allowed himself to feel, but the encounter with Joaquim had been a crack in his wall of resignation. The possibility, however small, that melody meant something worried him and terrified him at the same time. If there's a chance, he thought, that Peter is still out there, I can't ignore it. For the first time in years, Enrique felt an urge to action. He couldn't face the past alone, but he couldn't ignore what he had heard. The melody kept vibrating in his mind, calling to him like a distant voice in the fog. The day dawned with a light mist covering the city. Enrique looked out at the horizon from his office on the top floor of an imposing glass building. The phone, emails, and papers piled on his desk seemed irrelevant that morning. He had only one thought in mind: Joaquim. Determined, Enrique took out a card with the number of a taxi company he had picked up the night before and dialed. "I want the same driver as yesterday," he said firmly. "Joaquim Sousa. I need a punctual trip at 10 o'clock. The receptionist accepted the request without question. Enrique hung up and leaned back in his chair. Everything was up and running. At 10 o'clock, punctually like clockwork, the yellow taxi appeared in front of the entrance to the building. Joaquim rolled down the window and greeted him with his usual friendly smile. "Good morning, sir. Where are we going today?" Enrique got into the car, adjusting his tie while hiding his nervousness. "Take a walk around the city," he said in a carefree tone. "I'm in no hurry today." The taxi started off smoothly. For several minutes, silence filled the cabin. Enrique stared out the window, searching for the right words. He couldn't afford any mistakes. Finally, he turned to Joaquim casually. "Have you always been a taxi driver?" he asked, feigning curiosity. "Not always," Joaquim replied, without taking his eyes off the road. "I did a lot of things before driving a taxi. I worked in an orphanage for a while, but life brought me here." Enrique shuddered slightly upon hearing the word orphanage, but tried to remain calm. "An orphanage? That's admirable," he replied with a forced smile. "And how did you learn that song you were whistling yesterday? It's an unusual melody." Joaquim stopped whistling at that moment, as if the question had taken him by surprise. "Oh, that song," he murmured thoughtfully. "I think I learned it from someone at the orphanage, years ago. I was a kid. I was always whistling that tune. It stuck with me without realizing it." Enrique felt the air leave his lungs. A child. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the whole picture was still missing. "And what happened to that child?" Enrique asked, trying to keep his voice from betraying the inner storm. Joaquim shook his head. "I don't know, sir. It was a long time ago. Sometimes the children came and went. We never asked too many questions. The taxi continued to move slowly as Henrique processed the information. It was little, but enough to strengthen his intuition. There was a connection, however small, and he couldn't ignore it. "Do you mind if I call you again for another trip?" Enrique asked at the end, leaving a nice tip on the seat. Joachim smiled, not perceiving the true intentions behind the courtesy. "Of course, sir. I am always at your disposal." Enrique got out of the taxi, his mind spinning like an unstoppable wheel. Joachim didn't know what he was holding, but Henrique was sure of one thing. Pedro's name hadn't been spoken yet, but he was closer to the truth than ever. Henrique soon realized that he needed help. The feeling of being so close to an answer, but trapped in the shadows of the past, was unbearable. Joachim. He had pieces of the puzzle, but he couldn't get them alone. He needed someone who could move on the invisible edges of the truth without raising suspicion. That same night, Henrique called Laura Mendez, a private investigator recommended in discreet circles. The meeting took place in his mansion, in a room that barely had any life. Dark walls, shelves full of dusty books, and a yellow lamp that seemed more like a confession than a conversation. Laura arrived punctually, a middle-aged woman with her hair pulled back and a sharp gaze. She was dressed simply, but there was a firmness in her presence that inspired confidence. She sat down opposite Henrique, calmly crossing her legs, and took out a small leather notebook where she began to take notes. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Mendez," said Henrique, his voice controlled but somewhat trembling. "I need your discretion and efficiency in a personal matter." Laura tilted her head slightly, assessing her client. "People usually come to me when they want to know something they're not ready to hear," he replied seriously. "Is that your case?" Henrique stared at her. The comment weighed heavily on his chest. He wasn't sure he was ready, but he knew he couldn't back out. 15 years ago, I lost my son, Pedro," she began, breaking the silence. "He disappeared without a trace. I thought I had accepted his absence until yesterday a taxi driver whistled a tune." She paused for a moment to breathe. "That song only existed between my son and me." Laura raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Does the taxi driver know anything?" "I'm not sure," Henrique replied. "He claims to have learned it from a child in an orphanage, but he has no details. I need you to investigate his life, discreetly. Find out what you can about that orphanage and about Joachim Sousa." Laura quickly took notes as she listened. "Understood. Any limits on my research?" "None," Henrique answered firmly. "I need answers." Laura watched him for a moment before closing her notebook. Her gaze was understanding but professional. "I will seek the truth, Mr. Valladares, but you must be prepared for any outcome. Sometimes the answers we want are not the ones we find." Henrique nodded with a lump in his throat. "I prefer any truth to this uncertainty." Laura stood up, adjusting her bag. "I will send you updates whenever I have progress. Please be patient, but stay prepared." As Laura left the mansion, Henrique sank into the chair, feeling the weight of his decision. For the first time in years, he had opened a door that he might not be able to close. Joachim and the melody remained an enigma, but now at least, he was not alone in his search. 3 days later, Enrique received the first report from Laura. The investigator had worked with impeccable efficiency, as promised. The brown envelope rested on his desk, and Henrique looked at it as if it contained a truth capable of changing everything. Finally, he opened it with firm hands, taking a deep breath. Inside, a detailed summary with a black and white photo of an old orphanage awaited him. Laura had tracked Joachim to the Hogar San Lucas, a shelter for children without families located in the city's suburbs. Joachim had worked there for almost a decade, taking care of repairs and maintenance tasks, but that was not the most important thing. During the period that Joachim was in the orphanage, Enrique read in a low voice, there were records of a boy matching the description of her son, Pedro Valladares. The file was destroyed in a fire years ago, but one witness remembers a dark-haired, distant-looking boy who arrived at the orphanage alone and without a name. He was nicknamed Little Musician because he used to whistle a melancholy tune. Henrique left the paper on the table, his heart pounding. Little Musician. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. Pedro had disappeared at the age of 6 and the timing fit perfectly. So he was there, he muttered to himself. My son was in that place. The need to know more drove him out of the house. For days he had maintained casual contact with Joaquim. He would call him for meaningless tours, feigning friendliness while disguising his anxiety. But now every conversation seemed to be a missed opportunity. That day, Henrique decided to change tactics. Joaquim, if you're not in a hurry, would you like to have a coffee? Henrique asked at the end of a trip, just as the taxi stopped. The taxi driver blinked, surprised by the unexpected invitation, but smiled pleasantly. Of course, sir. I'm in no hurry. They entered a modest cafe on a quiet corner. Joaquim ordered a black coffee while Henrique barely touched his, staying focused on the target. You are a curious man, Joaquim, Henrique began, trying to sound casual. You told me about the orphanage where you worked. Did you ever get attached to children? Joaquim put the cup down on the table and looked at him with a nostalgic smile. One does not forget the little ones, Mr. Valadares. Many pass through there, but some... She paused as if wondering whether she should continue. There was one boy in particular who never left my mind. There was something special about him. He whistled a song all the time, a soft but sad tune. Enrique's heart stopped for a moment. What happened to that child? Joaquim sighed and shook his head. One day he disappeared, just as he arrived, without warning, without a trace. Many children came and went. It wasn't unusual, but he paused for a moment. I always wondered what happened to him. He seemed lost, but he had a strength in his gaze. Henrique swallowed, feeling the emotion burn in his throat. Did you ever know his name? He asked, barely whispering. No, he never said it. But when he went to sleep, he would repeat one word quietly, like a whisper. Dad. Henrique looked down at his cup, his chest tight. This couldn't be a coincidence. The boy Joaquim remembered had to be Pedro. Thank you, Joaquim, she said finally, her voice softer. It's good to know that someone took care of him, even if it was only for a short time. While Joaquim smiled without understanding the weight of his words, Henrique decided that he could not wait any longer. He had to find his son, no matter the price. Laura had a new assignment, to track down the little musician. Henrique stared out of his office window, the city stretching out like an endless labyrinth. Laura's reports lay on his desk, but his mind remained stuck on a single sentence. Little musician. Each clue brought him closer to Pedro, and at the same time filled him with uncontrollable fear. What would he find at the end of the search? The ringing of the phone broke the silence. Henrique quickly picked it up. Laura? He asked urgently. I have news, Mr. Valadares, the investigator replied, her voice as firm as ever. I found something that might interest you. Can you meet me in an hour? Henrique did not hesitate. In less than 40 minutes, he was in a small cafe where Laura was waiting for him with a folder in her hand. This time, her expression was more serious than usual. What did you find? Henrique asked as he sat down in front of her. Laura opened the folder, revealing a blurry photograph of a young man with dark hair and worn clothing, playing a guitar in a busy square. This man is a street musician, Laura explained. I found him in the western part of the city, near the Plaza das Flores. He whistles and plays a melody that they describe as unique, and it matches perfectly with the one you mentioned. Henrique felt the air catch in his lungs. He looked at the photo with trembling hands. Although time had passed, the young man's features were painfully familiar. Did he say something about his past? She asked quietly, as if fearing the answer. He doesn't talk much. He seems reserved, distrustful, Laura replied. They call him... The name struck Henrique like thunder. For 15 years, that name had been an echo in his thoughts, an open wound that never healed. Are you sure it's him? Her voice sounded more fragile than ever. Laura nodded. I can't be 100% sure, but there are too many coincidences. The place, the melody, the name. You have to see it with your own eyes. Henrique clenched his fists on the table. His heart was pounding, a mixture of relief and fear. Pedro, his Pedro, could be alive and so close. But what if he didn't recognize him? What if he rejected him? Where can I find it? He finally asked. Every afternoon he plays in the Plaza das Flores, near the main fountain, Laura replied. He comes and goes, but he never misses. It's as if that place were his refuge. Henrique nodded, trying to process the information. It was time to take the next step. That same afternoon, Enrique went to the Plaza das Flores. He walked slowly with his hands in his pockets and his heart beating like never before. The place was full of people, families, young people, and workers passing the time. But in the midst of the hustle and bustle, a familiar sound stopped him dead in his tracks. The melody. Enrique turned his head towards the source and saw it. A young man sitting on a bench, with a worn guitar in his hands and a hat at his feet. His fingers moved with precision over the strings, but it was the whistling that really stood out, identical to the one he knew. She stood there staring at him as if time had frozen. The young man had dark hair and a focused gaze, but there was something about his expression that was unmistakable. Peter. Enrique wanted to approach him, to call him by name, but fear paralyzed him. What would you say? How would you start? The weight of the years and the unspoken words kept him nailed to the ground. Pedro, she whispered barely, as if saying his name could break down that invisible wall. The young man did not hear him. He continued playing, oblivious to the man who was watching him from a distance, his eyes filled with unshed tears. In the end, Enrique was unable to get closer. He turned on his heels and walked away slowly, but in his mind there was only one certainty. It was him. Peter was alive. Enrique did not sleep that night. He stayed in the darkness of his room with the image of Pedro engraved in his mind. The young man with the guitar, the unmistakable whistle that seemed like a key to open doors closed for years. He had seen it with his own eyes, but he had not had the courage to approach. The next morning, she found herself in front of the mirror. The dark circles under her eyes betrayed fatigue, but her gaze reflected something else: determination. Today I won't stop, he murmured to himself, like a promise. As soon as the clock struck the evening, Enrique returned to the Plaza das Flores. He walked through the crowd, feeling each step heavier than the last. The sound of the guitar reached his ears, soft but constant, dragging him along like an invisible current. There was Pedro, sitting on the same bench, his silhouette hunched over the instrument. Enrique stopped a few meters away. Fear froze him. His thoughts were spinning out of control. What will I say to him? How will he react? Will he recognize me? Doubts consumed him, but a deep voice brought him out of his trance. Why don't you go and talk to him? Asked Joaquim, who had appeared at his side without Henrique noticing. Henrique looked at him surprised. What are you doing here? I come here sometimes too, Joaquim replied with his usual friendly smile. I saw him standing there like a statue and thought I'd give him a push. Enrique took a deep breath. It's not that easy, she admitted quietly. I haven't seen him in 15 years. What if he rejects me? Joaquim looked at him seriously, something unusual for him. If that young man is who you think he is, then he has waited as long as you have, even if you don't know it. Don't let fear decide for you. Enrique nodded slowly. Those words were what he needed to hear. With his heart pounding, he walked towards Pedro. Every step seemed like a challenge, but he didn't stop. When he was a few meters away, Pedro looked up. His gaze met Enrique's, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Pedro frowned, suspicious, but said nothing. Enrique, with a trembling voice, spoke for the first time. What's it called? Pedro, answered the young man, without letting go of the guitar. Enrique swallowed. Hearing his name confirmed hit him like a wave. Pedro, she repeated in a whisper. It's me, your father. Silence fell between them like a stone. Pedro stared at him in disbelief, his hands tensing on the guitar strings. My father, he said coldly. I have no father. Enrique felt those words cut through him like a knife, but he didn't back down. I know it sounds absurd after all this time, he continued, his voice breaking, but I haven't stopped looking for you for a single day. Pedro stood up, slinging his guitar over his shoulder. His gaze was still hard, but underneath there was something else. Confusion, pain. Look for me, he said bitterly. Where were you when I needed you? Enrique took a step toward him, trying to close that invisible distance. I failed to protect you, and I regret it more than you can imagine. But I'm here now, if you'll just let me be." Pedro stared at him in silence for a few eternal seconds. Finally, he shook his head and began to walk away. "I don't know what you want from me, but I don't need anything from you." Enrique watched him go, feeling helpless. The meeting had been a failure, but inside him, hope still burned. Pedro had not accepted him, but he had not closed the door completely either. The sun was beginning to set when Enrique returned to the Plaza das Flores for the third time. The previous evening had been a failure, but deep in his chest, that spark of hope was still burning. He couldn't let fear stop him now. Pedro had left with cold, harsh words, but Enrique had seen something in his eyes, a flash of recognition, a silent doubt he couldn't hide. With firmer steps than before, Enrique moved through the square, his eyes searching the crowd. He found him where he had first seen him, sitting on the bench by the fountain, with his guitar resting on his knees. This time, Pedro was not playing. He was staring into the distance, as if his mind was elsewhere. Enrique approached, his heart pounding. Upon noticing his presence, Pedro turned his head. His expression immediately became tense. "You again?" said Pedro, his voice containing a tone of contained annoyance. Enrique took a deep breath before speaking. "I'm not giving up, Pedro. Not after everything I've been through to find you." Pedro put the guitar aside and stared at him. "Find me? What do you want now? Fill the void in your conscience?" His voice was hard, but his hands trembled slightly. "Do you know what it's like to grow up alone, without answers? To think that no one was looking for you because you simply didn't matter?" Enrique closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of each word. When he opened them, his gaze was sincere, vulnerable. "I have no excuses. I lost my son that day, and I lost myself too. I lived 15 years with an emptiness that was impossible to fill, thinking that I would never have the chance to see you again." Pedro watched him, his gaze filled with resentment and confusion. "And now that you have me in front of you, what do you expect? For me to hug you?" "No, Pedro," Enrique replied softly. "I don't expect anything. All I want is a chance to get to know you. I can't change the past, but maybe we can build something in the present." Pedro lowered his head, his fingers playing nervously with the guitar strings. The silence between them was long, awkward. Finally he spoke, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can forgive him." "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," Enrique answered, taking a step towards him. "I'm just asking for time. If after that you decide that you don't want me in your life, I'll accept it. But I don't want to lose you again without fighting for you." Pedro looked at him, and for the first time, the hardness of his expression seemed to crack. There were tears in his eyes, but he did not allow them to fall. Without saying a word, he picked up his guitar and stood up. "See you later," he murmured before turning and starting to walk away through the crowd. Enrique stood there watching him disappear, feeling a mixture of relief and pain. Pedro had not rejected him completely. He had left a door open, even if it was just a crack. Enrique knew it. This time I wouldn't lose it. Enrique had been immersed in expectant silence for days. Since his last meeting with Pedro, he had lived with a mixture of anxiety and hope. Every sound on his phone, or the rustling of letters at the door, made him hold his breath. However, time continued to pass, and Pedro gave no sign. That morning, as he was drinking his coffee in the living room, the doorbell startled him. Enrique slammed down his cup and walked toward the entrance with hurried steps. When he opened it, he found his butler holding a plain, worn envelope. "This arrived a moment ago, Mr. Valladares," said the butler, handing it to him carefully. Enrique looked at the envelope. There was no return address, but he recognized the handwriting immediately. It was messy, as if the person writing it had hesitated at every step. "Peter." His hands shook as he tore the paper and unfolded the letter. He sat down in the chair, unable to stand. He took a deep breath before beginning to read. "I don't know why I'm writing to you. Maybe it's because I couldn't say everything when I saw you. Because since then, I can't stop thinking about what you said. 15 years is a long time. I find it hard to believe that you care after you disappeared from my life. I learned not to expect anything from anyone, and now you come along, talking about starting over. I don't know if I want that. I don't know if you deserve it. But it's true that there is something I can't ignore. Every time I play that song, I feel something different. Maybe it's the memory of someone who was there, even if I don't remember it. I don't promise you anything. I don't know if I can forgive or if I'm ready to open that door. But if you really want to know me, I'll give you a chance. I'll be playing at the Plaza Mayor this Saturday at 7. If you show up, it'll be your decision. If not, I'll know you were better off without me. Henrique left the letter on his knees, his eyes clouded with unshed tears. Each word was a torrent of emotions that shook him completely. Pedro had not rejected him. He was giving him something he could never have imagined, an opportunity. "Thank you," he murmured into the air, as if Pedro could hear him. For the first time in years, Enrique felt the weight on his chest begin to lighten. Saturday arrived with a clear sky, as if the city itself foreshadowed a special day. Enrique spent hours in front of the mirror, adjusting the knot of his tie, feeling clumsy for the first time in years. Everything had to be perfect. It was his second chance, and he wouldn't waste it. He arrived at the Plaza Mayor early. The streetlights were just beginning to come on, and a soft murmur filled the air. In the center, a small makeshift platform stood between benches and decorated bushes. People of all ages gathered around, some sitting on the ground, others standing, waiting for the music to begin. Enrique mingled with the crowd, his hands cold from nerves. Suddenly, there he was. Pedro stepped onto the stage with his guitar on his shoulder, his dark hair slightly disheveled, but his presence undeniable. Enrique felt his heart stop for a moment. It was as if he was seeing a reflection of the boy he had known, now transformed into a man carrying his own story. Pedro adjusted the guitar, looked at the audience with a mixture of shyness and determination, and finally began to play. The melody was the same, the song that Enrique had whistled so many years ago. Each note seemed to travel through time, carrying memories of happy nights at his son's bedside, before everything shattered. Enrique closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. This time there was no fear, only pure emotion. When the song ended, applause erupted, but Enrique stood still. Pedro looked out into the crowd and his eyes met his father's. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Enrique stepped forward, passing through the crowd until he stood at the foot of the platform. Pedro watched him silently without moving, but he did not look away. "You play beautifully," Enrique said, his voice barely audible, thick with emotion. "Thank you for inviting me." Pedro slowly stepped down from the stage, his guitar still in his hands. The space between them seemed enormous, but Pedro was the one who spoke first. "I didn't think you would come. I wasn't going to miss the opportunity," Enrique answered honestly. "Not this time." Pedro looked at him for a few eternal seconds and finally nodded with a slight smile, the first one Enrique had seen on his face. "I have another show next week," said Pedro in a softer voice. "If you want, you can come." Enrique felt a mixture of relief and happiness. They weren't grand words nor a hug of reconciliation, but it was a start. "I'll be there," he promised with a genuine smile. They walked together out of the square, their steps synchronized, though neither of them spoke much. It was a comfortable silence, as if they understood that words would come in time. Joaquin watched them from a distance, leaning against his taxi with a satisfied smile. "It's a good start," he muttered to himself, starting the engine. Enrique and Pedro continued walking towards the horizon illuminated by the lights of the city. There were no promises of a perfect future, but for the first time in years, they had both found something more valuable, a second chance to rebuild what time had broken. The story of Enrique and Pedro reminds us that sometimes the fear of facing the past prevents us from finding what we most long for. Enrique had to break down the barriers of his pride and his mistakes to get his son back, proving that it is never too late to seek forgiveness and rebuild what was lost. And you? If you had been in their place, would you have the courage to face your past ghosts and fight for a second chance? Click on the video that appears on the screen to continue your own self-discovery day and reflect on the decisions that shape our lives. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more inspiring and transformative stories. See you in the next video.